Hey guys, welcome to the Fat Dad Fishing channel. Tonight I'm going to go through I guess you could call it a mini course on tides and the impact that they have on flounder fishing. So thank you to everybody for tuning in for this. I know I've been gone a couple of weeks. I was on vacation and actually had prep for vacation and got to do some fishing down in North Carolina, mainly the Pamlico Sound for redfish and trout. So I got some videos coming up on that. I had a great week down there in a totally different type of fishery than what we fish up here north. So excited to get that out to you. But I wanted to do this this episode or this live stream on a topic that I really get a lot of questions about and have a lot of conversations about when we're out on the water. And it's really one of the most common questions that you get when you're fishing. People say, what's the best tide to catch flounder? Or when do you think is the best tide? Or when do you catch the most flounder? It's a very common question. We've all asked it. I've asked it a million times, and I'm sure everybody watching has asked it at least a million times as well. So I wanted to go through and just kind of, walk through it and give some facts and some information about it so that people have a better sense of the best times to go fishing for flounder and really understanding how tides do influence, tides and tidal currents influence flounder fishing and the success that you will or will not have. And one good thing about this is, it's the 19th of July right now, and this week is a big week. If you believe in tides and their influence and the currents and their influence on flounder fishing, which I absolutely do without question, and I could document for you, more success on certain tides and certain conditions. This week is going to be big for that because we have the full moon coming up this week. So this week, midweek, Wednesday through Saturday or Sunday, are really going to be prime time for getting out on the water for flounder. And I'm going to get through exactly why. So I'm going to jump right into this. As I jump right into this, please, if you, I see the comment. I'm going to talk about sheep's head. Actually, before I jump into this, let me take a step back. So I'm going to start experimenting with the new type of format for the live streams. I know I've only done a few, but I've gotten a lot of feedback on it. And one of the things that I did is I put a poll on the channel asking, what species are you really interested in? And not surprisingly, flounder was number one, fluke for those in the northern areas. And I will continue to do fluke. That's really, the fish, the species that I really like to target and I have a lot of success at. And I really want to share the information that I have on that to help people out. Sheep's head was actually number two. And interestingly enough, the live stream next Monday night, it'll be at 10:15 Eastern time. I'm going to have Kwa, known as That Asian Angler on Instagram. He's also one of the co-hosts for Tide Chasers podcast, which is a great podcast. I also actually happened to be a guest on that podcast a couple months ago. But man, Kwa is just a sheep's head fishing machine in New Jersey. So he's not just talking sheep's head. He's caught them. He's lived in Florida. He lives up here now, but he's really going to focus next week on a deep dive into New Jersey sheep's head fishing. And wait till you see some of the fish that he's gotten. This guy knows what he's doing. He's fished with the best, and he really puts up a lot of results on his boat. So yes, not only can we make a video for sheep's head, I plan on going out and getting some content on that myself, but I'm going to bring in a real expert next week with Kwa, and he's going to be on, and we're just going to have a conversation on the live stream about New Jersey sheep's head fishing. So hopefully those of you that are interested in, adding in, I'm not saying replace flounder fishing, but if you want to throw a second species in there, man, sheep's head have really made an impact on our area, and it's a really fast growing species to target in the northern areas. So we'll have that out next week. So just want to let everybody know that. So that's coming up, and I plan on having other guests coming up in future live streams as well. So with that said, I'm going to dive right into the flounder fishing and the impact of tides and current. And really, I hate to do this, but I kind of have to do this because we do have mixed experience levels with fishing. So I'm going to do a very quick jump into some really key terms that I'm going to be using that I just want people to know. And I'm literally going to hit this in a minute. And then I'm going to start diving into some more in-depth content. So some key terms that I'm going to be using: tide. And I want everyone to understand how I'm using it, because some people use it in different ways. So the tide is the vertical rise and fall of water levels in tidal regions. And I'm specifically going to be focusing on East Coast, United States. So it's the vertical rise. So it's essentially how deep is the water, and the changes in that depth throughout the day in the different cycles. The current is the horizontal flow of the water. So that's what's going from left to right, right to left, or straight at you. It's not up and down. Spring tides. This one I have to give the definition because people get this wrong all the time and they use it totally incorrectly. And it's very important for this conversation, especially because we have a spring tide this week. We have spring tides this week. It happens 2 times per month. It doesn't happen in the spring. Well, it does happen in the spring, but not only in the spring. It has nothing to do with the season. You get it 2 times a month on average. And it really just coincides with the new and the full moons. Neap tides is the opposite. So again, you get it 2 times per month throughout the year on average. And that's the first and third quarters of the moon. Diurnal tides, I bring these next 3 up just because you might hear them. Diurnal tides mean that you have 1 high and 1 low per day. Very limited in the United States. I think, honestly, it's really only portions of the Gulf of Mexico, and not even the entire Gulf. I think it's like the Panhandle and over towards Louisiana. I may be a little off on that, but I've never fished there, and it's not my area of expertise. Semi-diurnal tides, most of you are in the mid-Atlantic, northern Atlantic, but if you're on the Atlantic coast, that's what we have. We have the diurnal tides. We have 1 low, 1 high per day. I'm sorry, the semi-diurnal tides means that we're getting the 2 highs and the 2 lows per day. And then you have the mixed semi-diurnal tides. So you still have your 2 highs and 2 lows, but they're at different depths. And you really get that. That's mainly out in California. So they're really fishing for halibut and slightly different species out there. You also get that in the Caribbean. And then you have the ebb tide and the flood tide. Ebb tide just means the tidal flow is falling, so the depth is going down. It's going from high to low. And a flood tide is the opposite. It's the rising tidal flow. Doesn't mean it has to be really high tide for a flood tide. It just means the water's flooding in. It's coming in, so they call it a flood tide. So just want to make sure everybody has those clear as we go into this, and just so that we're on the same page, so you understand what I'm saying, and I'll explain it a little bit more. So as we go through this, if you do have any questions and you're watching the live stream, please feel free, put it in the chat. I'll do my best to keep looking over and answer the questions as they come up. If you're watching on a replay, put them in the comments, and I answer every comment. So unless it's rude, then I usually just ignore it. So feel free to do that. So let's just dive right in here. So now that we have the term, so tide, again, low tide, and this is the vertical movement, right? So low tide is marked by this line here, the dotted line, and the high tide is up at the top of the water here, and it's the distance between there. And notice it's measured from the mean low tide. So instead of going into the exact definition of mean low tide, just say it's the average low. It's not exactly that, but the average low tide in that area, and it's the vertical rise over that to high tide. That's really what your tides are in between there. And then we can go over and take a look at the tidal current, and that's where it flows. In this case, I'm showing it going left from right, or left to right. And let's just say that's the incoming. So when the tide comes in, it doesn't just flood up, it goes from one direction to the other. So in this, take a look at it and say, well, the current's coming from the left, going to the right, the inlet's on the left, the back bays are on the right. So if you're inshore, that's how it would be. Interestingly enough, if you are offshore and you are on the East Coast, another common misconception, or if you're surf fishing, this is really where you notice it. When you have a high tide, the tide doesn't come into shore. It's not how it works. When the tide is coming in and you are north of the equator, that tide, the current that's bringing that water in, is moving from south to north. So it's going from right to left if you're facing out east towards the Atlantic Ocean, and vice versa. So when the tide is falling, it's going from left to right. It's going to be very important when you set up your drifts that you understand this. Now, it can be affected by the wind. That can affect your drift. But the one thing that doesn't really, the biggest impact is if you're surf fishing and the tide is coming in, you got to know which way your line is going to go when you toss it out there. If you're chucking bait and you're letting it sit, it's going to start going on the incoming from your right to your left and vice versa on the outgoing. So just keep that in mind. So, but every tidal change does come with a tidal current, right? So the water just doesn't flood in from nowhere. It comes in, and it comes in with the current, and the current goes, the current is what pushes the water back into the back areas or north on the incoming from the equator and vice versa. So keep that in mind. So that's the tidal current. The current is actually, in my opinion, the most important part of the tides, which if you go back to that question, what's the best tide? Well, there's not a great answer for that because it's not really about how deep the water is for flounder. It's more about how is the water moving. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit. So you'll get to see where I'm coming from with that point. So now you have the tidal current going from left to right there. So let's jump into this spring tide that we have this week, and you'll get a little bit more understanding of the tides here. So the tides are affected by numerous things. And one thing is important. You get those tide charts. If you have a boat, you always you grab them at the tackle shop. You want to know when you have enough water. Keep in mind, those are just predictions. Those are not accurate. Tidal the tidal ranges are based on predictions that are chiefly around the location of the moon in relation to the Earth, and then the sun in relation to the Earth. The moon is much more important because it's closer, and it's really how much gravity are they putting onto the surface of the Earth, and how is that pulling on the water. So in this case, you can see for this spring tide, you have the moon over on the left of the Earth. You can see that's the water around the Earth, just kind of showing how it bows out towards the two gravity things. And you can see how that would put on the sides, it'll put out more. Oh, let me see here. Sorry. It'll put out more in this area tide. So it gets deeper because the gravity is pulling it away from the sides, right? Now, you can put the moon on the other side. It's the same thing. New moon, full moon. One's on one side of the Earth compared to the sun, and one's on the other. And it just adds more and more gravity, which means you get those higher tides, the spring tides. And that's what we have this week. We're going to have a spring tide. Now, what's important to know is that is typically associated with better fishing because it brings more current into the areas. You think about it. The tide cycle, the timing is going to be roughly the same, regardless of whether it's a spring tide or a neap tide, right? So if you have let's just call it approximately 6 hours between low and high tide, if you have a spring tide and you're going to add 5 feet of water on top of that low tide to get to high tide, well, it's still going to take 6 hours. But if you have a neap tide, it's only going to add 2 feet. It's going to take 6 hours to add 2 feet. That's your current. Right? So your current's not going to have to rush in there to fill in 6 hours. You can just kind of seep back into the backwaters. You can just kind of lazily move from south from the equator up to the north if you're offshore. But if you need to move 5 feet of water in those 6 hours, it's gonna have to go at a much greater pace, and that's where you get the currents. And if you bring it all the way back to flounder are ambush predators. They want to set up somewhere where the bait is going to get flushed towards them. So they love those currents. Other fish that love the currents are other ambush predators. Now, we're not talking pelagics, right? We're not talking about things like mackerel or tuna. They don't care nearly as much about those currents because they're not sitting there waiting for anything. They're continuously moving. Actually, they'll die if they stop moving. A flounder can just sit. A weak fish can just sit in the current. A speckled trout can just sit in the current and face into it and wait for something to come around a corner. Weak fish is a great example. They're called tide runners for a reason. They really run when the tides in the spring tides, because the spring tides bring a lot of current, and it sweeps with the higher tides. It sweeps a lot of the forage that they love, which are crustaceans, shrimp, off of the sod banks and down into the channels, and they just wait for it to come by. And they just, when that high tide is running out and it's coming off those sod banks, great time for weak fish. It's the same thing for flounder. They love the current. It dislodges all of the things that they eat. They also eat crabs. They also eat shrimp, as everybody knows. So the more current, typically the better for them. So spring tides, this is what happens, and this is why you have more current flow and you have the higher tides. It's basically, now there are other things. Wind is a factor, barometric pressure is a factor, whether it rained, if you had a huge storm, that's a factor. But by and large, it really comes down to where's the moon and where's the sun. And that's what those tide charts really show you. That's all that they know. They're just going to know approximately where those are at any given time, so they can set up those moon phases for you. So that's the spring tide, right? So now let's go over and take a look at the neap tide. Very simple. It's a quartering moon, right? So it's now 90 degrees off from the sun. Now, again, look at how the water in this now kind of bows in both directions. So you're not going to have nearly the swing between low tide and high tide, which means you're not going to have nearly the current that you would have for a spring tide, right? These are just, one's offsetting the other. Now the moon, again, has more pull because it's closer. The sun, despite being, 360 times, I think, the size of the moon, 3,000 times, it's so far away. It only does about a third of the impact on the tides as compared to the moon. So this is the neap tide. It's not going to move the water a lot. So if you have a choice, and you know that a flounder, being an ambush predator, likes more current, more flow of the water, and you have a choice between a neap tide and a spring tide, take the spring tide every day, every single day, because you're going to get more movement there. It's going to be easier for them to find food. They don't have to go hunting for it. It's going to get flushed to them. So all they have to do is find the location where the bait's going to make it to them. They just set up and wait. And I'll go into some places where you can see that and where you can find that in a little bit. All right, so that's a neap tide. Again, any questions, put it in the chat. I'm happy to stop and answer those as we go through this, right? So I want to make this interactive if you have any questions. All right, so let's go on to the next slide here. All right, so the spring tide. Now this, I want to show you this. Now this right here is a screenshot from smartfishingtides.com. I've mentioned that before. It is a site that is owned by Saltstrong, so you have to be a member to use it. But and if you want to be a member, there's a link in the description of this. You can click that and you can join. It's a great deal. I'm not going to go a lot into that right now, except to say I'm a member and it's worth it. And I know that there's a couple of other members watching right now who would agree with me. But you can get this on any tide chart, any website. You can really take a look at this. And then this is what a spring tide looks like. And this is actually this coming Saturday, right? So the spring tides last a couple of days before and a couple of days after a new or a full moon. And that's what we have this week. So what I'm looking at here is really here's the flow, right? So here's your mean low right here. So it's going to go a little bit lower than that in the low tides, and it's going to come up high. And take a look at the difference here. So at the peak high tide, now there's a little bit different, right? If the moon and the sun aren't on the same side, it's going to be a little bit less, a little bit more. But take a look at this. There is a 5-foot difference between high tide and mean low tide in this area that I pulled up randomly on the East Coast for this weekend, right? So that's a 5-foot swing. So they're going to have 5 feet of water coming in between low tide and high tide. And the thing that you really want to look at is you want to find where's the best current flow. Well, look at how steep this angle is right here that goes right through where it says 5-foot difference. Let me see if I can get it up there on. So right in through here, right? Look how steep that is as compared to like over here. That's a much shallower slope, which means the water's coming out slower, which makes sense. You still have the 6 hours, but it's less water in this case, right? On this first high tide at 9 a.m. It's got less water to travel in. So this is actually when I'm going to be looking at the best time to fish. And what's even better about this is it's going to start getting dark around 9 o'clock, right? So once you hit the dark, I've mentioned this before, flounder fishing at night is amazing. The dark is the best time. Sunset is a great time. Sunrise is good too. But personally, I would say you'd want to fish sundown. But this is the slope that you want to fish. So I would look at seeing on this day, on Saturday, which is actually, this is the chart I'm going to be using when I'm fishing. I definitely want to be fishing in this time if I can. Most likely I'm going to be stuck down in here though, the 5 a.m. Till about 3. So I'm essentially going to do this incoming and this outgoing here. But I'm going to anticipate the best tidal flow is going to be in this section, in this middle section here, where the slope is the steepest, and that's where the current's going to be the best. So I really want to focus on that as being a good time for picking up some flounder. Now keep in mind, just because you have a lot of current flow doesn't mean you can fish anywhere there's current for flounder. Flounder are fish, and they are out there and they eat to survive. They're not going to open the refrigerator, and they're not just going to be able to grab a snack. They're not going to be able to run out to fast food. They have to expend energy to get their food, which means they're expending energy to get energy. They're not necessarily going to hang out in the highest current areas, but what they are going to do is hang out in locations that are close to those, maybe off to the side, maybe at the top of a bank, maybe at the bottom of a ledge where that's just outside of the main current. You should be looking for eddies where you get this wicked current, especially, look at a bridge piling. You get a wicked current coming around there because the current comes in, and when it hits a piece of structure, it has to accelerate around it. But then it comes to the back side of it, and you have this pool behind it where the water is barely moving. That is where a flounder is going to be sitting. So, bridge pilings are easy to say because they're so easy to see. But if you take a look at a Navionics chart, again, Smart Fishing Tides has Navionics in there, so you can look at different locations. You can almost envision what the underwater looks like and how the water will flow through that structure. And you can find those little ledges and those little spots that you can really target to fish. So here's the spring tide. Look for where the current is moving the most on those. It's moving 5 feet of water in 6 hours. It's going to be a great opportunity to be catching fish on that day. Neap tide, here is the same location a week. So this is the 31st. And it's going to be a neap tide. It's going to be a quartering moon. It's only a 2-foot difference. And look at that. I mean, both high tides, it's literally a 2-foot difference, maybe 2.3 feet difference between the bottom and the top. So it's going to be much weaker tides. In this case, when you're fishing for flounder, you may want to find the highest current area you can and get right in it, right? Because it's going to be a much different flow than you had before. The flounder are not going to have to work very hard to stay in that. They're going to be able to sit in there. They're going to be able to wait for the bait to be flushed through to them, and they can just kind of wait for it in a moderate current, and then they can just pick up and eat and just set back down where they were. They're not necessarily going to want to do that on the spring tide where you got a 5-knot current, where boats can't even hold, where your anchor's getting pulled, or it's impossible to pull it back up when you're done. So neap tide, it does offer great fishing as well, but you got to be really aware of where those currents are and look for in this case, I would be much more likely to push my fishing time out from the 5 a.m. when I usually start 5 or 6 a.m. And get towards this where there is more current and take advantage of that. I would adjust my fishing time more on that day if possible than on a day with a spring tide where, the most wicked currents are. I'm probably going to want to avoid those a little bit anyway. And try to fish off to the sides. So that's your neap tide. And again, it's the first quarter, third quarter, and then the new and the full moon or the other two, and that's where you're going to get your spring tides. There are a bunch of others in there. You got the waxing gibbous and crescent and all that other crap. That you just got to take a look at the chart and see where is it getting closer to the new moon and the full moon. The closer it is to those, the more tidal flow you're going to get. So make sure that you take a look at that and make sure you really consider that. So let's jump in and give you an example. So here's a spot. So let's say you have let's take both examples in this, right? So we have the spring tide. So we have a lot of water. Now the inlet is actually off to this direction over here on the right. It's not very close in this situation, but let's pretend the inlet's just right off to the right. So it's an outgoing tide. So you're going to have the current pushing from left to right. You're also going to have it coming from top to bottom down this section right here. So the question is, on a spring tide, when it's going to be a really fast current, where are the places that you might look in this certain situation to give yourself the best chance to hook up with a flounder, and not just a flounder, because you could probably literally find a flounder anywhere in here just by chance, but the biggest flounder. The biggest flounder are going to be the ones that you know, stake their claim to the best spots, and they make the little flounder move around them. So where are you going to look? Well, in this case, you know it's going to be a fast current. So think about how it travels over the structure, right? So you've got some pretty decent structure in here, but the biggest thing that you have, if you're taking a look at this middle section right here, the biggest thing that you have is this point right here, right? And this is the most important point because, again, the current's coming down and then it's coming off to the right. So the water is rushing around this corner. So the question is, where would a flounder most likely be? You take a look at the structure, you see it gets deep, but you can see, look at this right here. So there's like shelves there, and it drops off and down into this little pool area here. So the water is going to come around this corner. It's getting pulled around the corner on the outgoing. So this is going to be wicked. Oh, sorry. It's going to be really fast right in this section here, and that might end up being too fast for the flounder. However, if you go right up ahead of it, it's an ambush predator. It's going to sit there and wait for things to come up to the structure. You might want to look up top here, and you might want to look down in this area right here, right? Because this area, if the water comes around, it's not going to take an immediate 90-degree turn and go right along this bank. It's going to spill around and out this way, right? So you may have a little bit of an eddy in here. If you have a little bit of an eddy in here, and you have this structure, and for those that aren't aware, the closer these lines are to each other, the more drastic the depth change between the lines. Think of a topographical map, but just showing the bottom of these channels. That's what this is. If you have an eddy and you have this type of shelf here, man, on the outgoing tide, I would try to set up in here, in that section right in here, and I would go to the bottom. Not all the way into the current, but you know, if you can see the seam on an eddy here, fish that seam within a couple of feet of that seam, and you should have flounder just sitting there waiting for things to get swept by. They can jump out, jump into that current, grab what they want, or they're going to grab something that gets spit out of that current and into the eddy, and it's just going to land right on their heads, and they're just going to come up and take it. So that's a great spot right there. Fishing ahead of a structure is great for an ambush predator as well. So never ignore just ahead of great structure like this. So even though there's not great structure up here, fish it anyway. You know, what I have found is early in a tide, and this is just anecdotal, but early in a tide cycle, let's say going from high to low, they'll start up here, and then I catch more at the top of the structure, and then they kind of move down. And my theory, again, just a theory, is that as they feed, they're picking up and they're following down with the current. They're picking up what they're going to eat, and then they settle back down, and they do it again, and they just keep following the current down until they get to the bottom of the structure, and then they hang for the rest of the tide. And then as it shifts to the next one, they turn around, they face into the current, and they just kind of work it back the other direction. That's my theory. It seems like that's what happens for me all the time, though. So never hesitate to fish just ahead of that. But you can see how the tide definitely impacts this. If you have a neap tide and there's not as much current in here, you know, you're going to have a 2-foot swing in the entire cycle. You're not going to have an eddy that's really worth looking at back here, because there's no reason for a flounder to think about an eddy. They can just kind of sit down in here right in the main flow of it, and they can pick up some better things. So I would actually stay down all the way towards the bottom of this ledge if I was fishing on an outgoing neap tide here. Now there are other spots in here that I would look. You know, here's a point. Actually, on the incoming, I would fish the opposite sides of these at the bottom. But you know, there are other spots, but you got to keep that in mind. So your spot changes and this is a substantial change. Once you start really dialing in on flounder, it's not, hey, let's move 2 miles. Let's go to this bridge. Let's go to that bridge. It's, you know what, we're about 30 yards off. You're looking at your depth finder and you're seeing, this is not quite the structure I want, or this drop off is too steep, so I need to go to this other side. On the incoming, I'm going to want to stay up top, right, on the higher, because the water is going to get swept up. Let's say an incoming spring tide with a strong current. All that stuff's coming in the deep, but it has to go up over these ridges to get into the shallow up here. Well, they're just going to sit in the shallow. Why are they going to sit in 30 feet of water trying to get the bait that's sweeping through and have to cover 30 feet when they can come up here in 6 feet and they have pretty much the entire view above them? You know, I've never caught a flounder topwater in 6 feet. Let's say it goes up to 3 feet, 2 feet. They got the entire water column covered. So they may sit at the top of the ledges in that case. So that's how I'd switch that on the incoming. But again, the neap tide, it opens up more areas. And here's the key thing. The fish are still going to be there, but if it's a neap tide, they could be anywhere because there's no areas that they're really going to have to avoid. You know, they don't care about the current, so they can sit over here in this hole if they want. They can sit right off of this structure right here. They can sit off of this little, well, this looks like a pretty good bump in here. You know, they could sit right in this little pocket here because the current's not going to move them, and you know, the bait's still going to swim by. But if they're in a really high flow area, they're not going to sit right here. They're not going to sit right in the middle of that because they're going to get exhausted trying to get their food. They're going to be off to the side. So that's the problem with the neap tides, and for me, why I think they're harder, because the fish can just spread out. It's less predictable. Now one of the questions that's in here is, D's end, he says, I find outgoing tide is best a lot. Why is that? So I find that I catch them pretty much in the same numbers. I used to not catch them in the same numbers. I used to catch them more on the outgoing, but now I find that I catch about even numbers on either tide. However, I think the one thing that you have on the outgoing that you don't have is a little bit more predictable path for the fish. But you also have, especially if you're fishing like sod banks like we're seeing on the screen, that high tide is now coming off of the top of those banks, and any shrimp, any crabs, or anything that gets washed out of there, any little minnows that were hiding up in that grass now have to retreat back into the channels, and now they start getting flushed on the outgoing. So outgoing for me is all about choke points and points and underwater, you know, almost like V areas where everything kind of has to get flushed through one little area, because all that stuff is coming out of the grass and it's got to go somewhere. It's going to just get swept away. So I'm going to find all the places where a big creek starts to, you know, winnow down into something that's a little bit thinner, and I'm going to fish the thinnest part of that and try to get where it all comes together. It's just like a funnel, right? So all that stuff gets washed off of those sod banks. It's got to go somewhere, and it's going to go down current, and it's going to go to the choke points. But on the incoming, you don't have that. Those fish are just waiting to get back up into the grass. So I think that that might be why you're finding outgoing tide is the best, because, you know, I don't think it's the best, but I think it can be easier to find the fish. I think it just kind of, it just makes it easier to predict where they're going to go, because all that runoff that comes off of those sod banks, you know where it has to go, and you know it brings extra forage into the water that the flounder are going to be picking up on. So that's my thought on it. And you know, I think if you've seen my other videos, you know I've done pretty well. I may not know everything, but I at least have a little bit of credibility on that. Like, I think it's just easier to catch it on the outgoing. I would prefer to fish the outgoing if I just want to get some tight lines out there and put some fish in the boat without a doubt. Which is also different topic, but I'll mention this, which is also why I absolutely love fishing late July through August for flounder in the backwaters. A lot of people hate it. They're like, don't even do it. Hang it up till September, fish the last couple of weeks. No, I don't do that because it makes it more predictable. Just like maybe the outgoing tide can make it more predictable because you have that the forage going in the water, which can turn on a bite. Well, think about it. You get the hot water. They're not sitting in the 6 feet anymore. You know, 3 weeks ago, you couldn't find them beyond 15 feet of water for the most part. And they were typically up around 7 to 10 feet because there was so much, the water was cool. It was comfortable for them in 100% of the backwaters. Now change it to 85-degree water or 80-degree water. They're getting a little bit less comfortable. They're not sitting up in the flats. during the day. They're sitting down in the deeper areas. Well, if that's the case on this map, I'm ignoring all of this. I'm ignoring all of this, all of this. I'm only hitting this area because it's ahead of structure, and I'm hitting all of this deep stuff because they want the water temperature that's going to be down in the 70s. So they're going to look for anything that's going to give them a little bit more comfort, and that's going to be the cooler water in the deeper areas. Off of the mud flats, especially the darker mud flats, they're going to be looking for those sandy bottoms, especially summer flounder. They're going to be looking for the sand. So, you know, it makes it more predictable. So I'll give the same answer for hot water in the back. My understanding is it's warmed up pretty good, which I love. You're going to start catching the hogs now. And then the outgoing, it makes it more predictable because you know you're going to get a better chance for a bite turning on once that water really comes off the top of those banks and fills up all the feeding areas. All right, so let's look one other spot. So this is a spot, you know, inlet. This is an incoming spot. Let's say the current's coming up, and I'm just curving it around here. This is just a channel that comes back. You can really see, again, the difference here of where you might want to fish. If you have this really wicked current coming around, it's going to come around, it's going to hit around this back side here. And you're going to get your eddy in this area here. So on the spring tide, the really wicked tides, if the current's coming in this direction and it starts to bend around and come into this creek, I'm going to be really looking in this area and these depth changes in here as the primary area, and especially if there's an eddy. If there's not an eddy, I'm still going to fish that. I'm just going to be very careful because you're going to go up to 3 feet and 1 feet up in here. So if you're in a boat, be careful, but you know, look for that eddy. Look for the seams in the water that indicate that there's something changing in the current underneath. And the real strong current, again, they're not going to sit in there. They're going to look for something right next to it, and an eddy is a perfect spot. So I would sit in this area here. Again, the neap tide, if it's not flowing really strong, I'm actually going to fish this all the way in here. I'm going to fish all the way back in here. I'm going to fish all the way around this outside. And I can tell you, I did fish a neap tide in this exact location. It's in one of my videos from earlier this spring. It's actually before flounder season opened, and I caught nice 20-incher. I think it was 20. It was somewhere 19 to 22, somewhere in there. Right up in this area right here. Wouldn't be fishing this area on a spring tide, no way, because that's going to be whipping right up along the sod here and coming around this corner. So I'd be looking back in here. So again, you fish it differently, but those fish are still going to be in the same area. They're just going to be in slightly different spots within that area or within that region. So that's what I'm going to be looking for in that case. So I hope this is helpful. Hopefully it gives people, you know, a little bit of a different perspective when it comes to tides, and you'll be able to tell people, you know, if they say, well, what's the best tide? Well, there is no best tide. There are different tidal conditions that would make you say, well, I want to fish outgoing. Now, if you just want to depend on that extra bait coming off the sod banks, outgoing, and that fits your style, that might be best for you. But you're going to be able to catch on any tide. I catch a lot of fish when other people aren't fishing, which is dead low tide. I love dead low tide because, again, it makes it more predictable. There's so many areas where they can't be because it's too shallow. There's no bait up in the flats. So I just go for the deeper areas, the deeper holes and channels when it's low tide, and I'll fish that. And I think oftentimes a lot of people that say, no, you can't fish dead low, it's because they don't fish it. So they don't know. You can catch a lot there during dead low tide or during the tide shifts. So hopefully this is helpful. There are a lot of other things that you can consider. If people are interested, I could do other videos on those. When you really get into the salooner, the major and the minor periods are incredible times to fish. If you know what a major and a minor period is, there are different times during the day where it's supposed to be the best time to catch fish, and I really do believe in that. And when you have the major and the minor line up within an hour or two of a sunrise, a sunset, or a moonrise and a moonset, I mean, again, I could document for you where I've just had ridiculous days. I mean, absolutely, like every, within that hour to 2 hours, it's like every cast you're just getting fish left and right. And not just fish, but fish with some big size. So we can talk about that. Other things to consider: rising and declining air pressure is very important. Think about it this way, and a lot of people ignore this, right? If you're not checking the barometer when you're planning things out, you don't have to, but you're doing yourself a little bit of a disservice, because think about these fish. Most fish have a swim bladder. So when there's a higher air pressure, it means there's more weight coming down on the water, which means there's more weight coming down on the fish. When there's less on the fish, so it can make them behave differently. So you just understand that. It's just another tool to throw in there. Now, I'm not going to say that that's anywhere near as important to the tides and the tidal currents that you have, and the wind, which also affect the tidal currents. I think those are the most important from my perspective. But yeah, that's critical stuff to consider. You can look at the salinity, which means, has it rained? How hard has it rained? What has it done to the backwaters? Flounder, as an example, Flounder is a great example. Flounder love high salinity. There's a reason that people catch them offshore and catch them in inlets. It's because they love high salinity. So when you have like a storm go through, a tropical storm like we had last week, and it brings a ton of rain, well, it's going to drop the salinity in the backwaters, and those flounder will tend to pick up and move out closer to the inlets so that they can enjoy more salt in the water. Dissolved oxygen, which is affected by the wind. These are all these things that I think that you should consider. Doesn't mean you always change your plans based on it, right? The most important thing is you fish when you can fish, but you can use these things to help you to determine, well, what's going to be the best spot for me? What's the best location? Take a look at the wind direction. If the wind direction in this case, in this slide on the screen right now, is coming in this direction, opposite of the current, I may look for another spot, because wind against tide sucks. When you're in a kayak or in a boat, it's terrible. It's fishable, but it's much more difficult. So I may, instead of fishing this point, I may go back to the other one, because in the other one, if I had the wind coming in this direction, I can deal with that, because now it's the wind with the current, right? In this setup, right? If it's coming from that direction. So those are all things to consider. So again, let me know in the comments. Send me an email, rich@fatdadfishing.com, if there are any specific topics that you'd want to see. If you have any questions and you're in the live stream, just quick put them in now, and I'll see if I can answer them before I go. But again, before I wrap it up, I just want to go back to what I said at the beginning for those that weren't here. We're going to go into next week some sheep's head fishing, and we're going to focus on New Jersey sheep's head. And I'm going to be bringing on Kwa, who is on Instagram. He's That Asian Angler. He is also the co-host of Tide Chasers podcast. And if you've seen him on Instagram, if you've listened to Tide Chasers, this is a dude that knows sheep's head, and he knows New Jersey sheep's head. He's made it his mission to understand the fish and to catch the fish. And he has caught some monsters himself. And on his boat, he has put his guests on some just beautiful fish over the past couple of years. So he's going to come on. He's going to share with everybody and with me. That is not my forte. I've caught sheep's head, but I'm nowhere near him. He's like the maestro of sheep's head. So he's going to come on, and we're going to go through tactics. We're going to go through locations. We're going to go through all of that and try to help you guys get on this growing fishery in New Jersey, New York, Delaware. It's already down in Maryland and South, but it's moving back up north where it used to be. And people say, well, it's the climate change. Well, there is a bay in New York called Sheepshead Bay, and it wasn't just named that because somebody liked it. It's because it used to have a ton of sheep's head. Well, they're coming back, right? They're coming back. They're coming through South Jersey. I've been out fishing for them, spent, maybe a combined 2 or 3 hours over 3 trips. I haven't gotten one yet. I've been picked 1,000 times. So hopefully Kwa will be able to help me out as well as all of you. and get us on some nice fish. He's a great guy, so he's going to be on next week. And then after that, I hope to get other guests on to talk about other types of fisheries, other types of fish, and other topics. So again, any topics that you want to hear, let me know. So Roadkill Crew, NJ, any opinions on Skull Bay? Good, bad, so-so? I don't know. Send me an email, rich@fatdadfishing.com. I'll take a look at it. I honestly think I know of 2 Skull Bays. So I'm not exactly sure. I'm not exactly sure which one you're talking about. And quite frankly, I don't remember where either of them are. So I'd have to look at that. Happy to do it, though. I think, John, that the sheep's head are up in the Raritan Bay. I'm pretty sure they are. They're going to be in similar spots as Tog. Again, I know that they're catching sheep's head up in Long Island. So, and by the way, South Jersey people, if you didn't realize this, there was a redfish caught in South Jersey, a nice redfish caught in South Jersey this week. So it's time, as I told my friend John, it's time for us to start going unicorn hunting because they're around. And I did some red fishing last week in North Carolina, and man, they are, if you've never caught a red, you got to catch a red. Those things are like little Mack trucks. And the one that I caught, the bigger one, was only 24.5 inches. Caught it on the same gear that I used for flounder out of the kayak, and man, it was great. And I'm going to be looking for them actually this weekend, see if I can find some. Cobia, man, it's funny you mentioned cobia. I saw a couple of cobia down there, and by the time I saw them, there were 2. I couldn't cast to them, but I have heard that cobia. I didn't hear that they were around yet this year, but that would be awesome. If you guys are picking up any of these alternate species or any cool flounder, send me the pictures too. I'd love to share them with everyone, so everyone can see what everyone's picking up. It shouldn't just be about the fish that I'm catching or not catching. You know, I have a lot of interaction with a lot of you guys throughout the week through emails, texts. I hit the water with a lot of you, like John in the chat right now. We've gone out fishing a couple times. Actually met him on the water in Raritan Bay. So send me the pictures. I'd love to see them. I'll put them up on the, in one of the videos to share them with everyone so they can see how you're doing. Be really happy to do that. Joe, I went fishing in a tournament with Joe a few weeks ago. Had a great time. It was a really tough day, but had a great time hanging out with Joe for the day. Sean's asking, while drifting a kayak, how do you make sure the lure is directly below you and not ahead or behind due to current? So I actually did a video on that. It's what John Skinner calls line scope. It's really going over the angle of declination, I guess is really the technical term. But so if you don't, in some cases, you don't want it to scope too much. If you want to do the true up and down jigging, in a kayak, I have a drift sock, and I really recommend everybody get a drift sock. Now I believe it's a 22-inch drift sock. I have about a 13.5 foot kayak. It's pretty heavy. It's an Old Town Big Water. And I think it's actually the drift sock's a little small. So I wish I had gotten a 26-inch, but they're only like $20. So go out and get a drift sock and you drop that in. Those are going to be critical for slowing your drift when the wind is taking you and the wind versus current. It's going to keep you with the current, and you're going to go slower than the current, but I don't think that's a bad thing. As long as you're going with the current, your bait's going to present more naturally. So I would use that, and then I would start looking at different jigs. Maybe go a little bit heavier, but I typically don't go over an ounce to an ounce and a half ever in up to 40 feet of water. Because I find that I can, if I either pedal into or with a current to get the correct drift speed, or use that drift sock, or both. And you should be able to do a pretty good job at slowing that drift. Now, there are cases where you do want that line scope. So keep that in mind too. There are times where, you don't want that true vertical jig. You want it to more skip across the bottom. You may want to stir up a lot of sand. In which case, just embrace the scoping and go with it. The other thing that I do is, and you'll probably see this, I think I cut this out on most videos. I don't typically show the cast or the deployment of the line. I typically actually cast it up into the current and let the current bring it back to me. And that's where I start adjusting as it's coming back and I'm bouncing it. I start to get a sense of the current. And that's where I start moving the pedals. And that's where I start dropping drift socks. And if you notice in my videos, it's pretty rare when I'm fishing in New Jersey or New York, especially with the currents that we have and the tidal flow that we have. It's very rare for me to stop pedaling, almost at all. There was a day this year that I made a decision I wasn't going to stop pedaling until it really didn't make sense to be pedaling. So I made a commitment that I was going to keep pedaling and I was going to keep positioning the best I could through the whole day. And it was 6 straight, almost just under 6 straight hours of pedaling to keep. And I didn't have a drift sock, so I had to, but I didn't want to sacrifice any time. And it worked out well. I was able to keep it pretty much straight up and down. I believe I had a 1 ounce, maybe a 1.5 ounce jig at that time, but that's what I do. So really get on the drift sock, go buy one. You can get, I think the brand that I have is just one of those cheap Amazon, I think it's called Moocy, M-O-O-C-Y, a Moocy drift sock. And it was 22-inch. Again, if you have a bigger kayak like a PA, an Old Town Big Water, I might go with a 26-inch. Just put that out there. Let it get deep. The drift socks shouldn't sit up at the top. You let them get deep. Let all that line out. Let it get 20 yards off of the bow or the side of the kayak. If you wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that, drifting with the drift sock on the side. But if you don't have an anchor trolley, you may be limited to that. But let it get deep in the water, and then it really holds that current and it really moves you in a good direction and a good speed. So, all right. So with that, thank you everybody for checking this out. Again, if you've made it this far and you're not subscribed and you found some value in this, I'd really appreciate some subscribes, likes, shares are really important. But to me, the most important is comments, especially for those that aren't in the chat and are going to be watching this as a replay afterwards. Comments or even emails. I really want to hear from everyone. It's more about building a community of people that are working together to help each other catch more fish than it is about me just throwing out videos of me catching fish. So any feedback that you have, I'm always open for it. And with that, thank you very much again, and I'll catch you in the next one. And don't forget, get out there for the spring tides this weekend. I will see you out there. I will be on the water somewhere in I believe South Jersey, looking for flounder, and probably looking for a redfish or two. So good luck to y'all. I'll catch you later.